Dobrodošli na 14. Competo dogodku. Danes bomo odpirali kar nekaj tem, ampak vse se bojo vrtele okoli glavnega vprašanja. Ali lahko podjetja preživijo brez šefov?
Za organizacije brez šefov bi lahko rekli, da so kot vozila brez voznika. Še pred leti nekaj povsem nepredstavljivega, danes pa že predstavljajo skoraj našo prihodnost. In tudi to bo rdeča nit tega dogodka, saj se v Competu zavedamo, kakšne izzive prinaša prihodnost. Ampak danes na odru nisva čisto same, ne Maša?
Tako je. V Competu smo si zato umislili novega pomočnika, Competka. Naš virtualni asistent se sicer mudi še nekje zunaj dvorane, ker si je pozabil uro naštimati na zimski čas. Malo se še uči tale naš Competko. Competko, kje si?
Pozdravljeni vsi udeleženci. Trenutno se nahajam v Avstrija Trend hotelu, v garaži. Namreč moje avtonomno vozilo ni bilo pravilno parkirano. Samo trenutek, takoj bom z vami. To pa je prava dvorana. Še enkrat pozdravljeni z moje strani in dobrodošli na Competu dogodku. Sem Competko, virtualni asistent. Pravijo mi tudi pogled v prihodnost. Namreč tehnologija je danes tu in bomo tudi ostali tu. Ampak kaj se bo v prihodnosti dogajalo s šefi? Maša, kaj ti meniš?
Kje si ravno mene našel, Competko? Ampak okej, ne delim svoje mnenje. Mislim, da bojo vedno obstajali šefi na nek način. Vedno bo tu nekdo, ki bo prevzel odgovornost in sprejel ključne odločitve. No, pa tudi odobril dopust. Competko, kako greš pa ti na dopust?
Kaj je to dopust?
No, očitno tudi umetna inteligenca še nima vseh odgovorov. Ampak verjamem, da imate kar nekaj vprašanj tudi vi, dragi gostje. Tako da vas vabim, da se nam pridružite v razpravi preko spletnega orodja Slido. Vse, kar storite, je, da obiščete tole spletno mesto, vpišete kodo hashtag Competo 2019 in naši govorci bodo lahko odgovorili na vaše vprašanja.
Kar nekaj odgovorov in tudi kakšno vprašanje pa imata naša prva gosta. Prvi del tega dua predstavlja Lisa Gill, svetovno priznana strokovnjakinja, coachinja in predavateljica, ki svoje pristope usmerja v decentralizacijo, agilnost in vključenost organizacij ter timov. Je ustvarjalka in vodja podcasta Leader Morphosis, s pomočjo katerega raziskuje vse prisotnejši svet samoupravnih in naprednih organizacij. V sklopu podcasta je gostila in intervjuala nekatere izmed vodilnih svetovnih mislecev in praktikov z področja prihodnosti dela. Je tudi ustanoviteljica podjetja Reimaginer in trenerka v organizaciji TUF Leadership Training. V obeh vlogah išče kreativne, v prihodnost usmerjene pristope s ciljem implementacije teorije v učinkovito prakso na področju prihodnosti dela.
Drugi pa je nam vsem zelo poznani Timms, ustanovitelj in Energy Chief Officer v organizaciji People and Transformational HR. Je tudi član organizacije CIPD, TEDx govorec in mednarodni predavatelj. Perry je tudi napisal knjigo HR Transformation, je gostujoči predavatelj na Halt International, Sheffield Hallam University Business School in GEA College v Ljubljani. Perry je poznan po številnih HR hackatonih, ki jih na lokalnem in mednarodnem nivoju skupaj s podjetji ustvarja nove in inovativne pristope k delu. Lani je bil uvrščen na 5. mesto lestvice najbolj vplivnih HR mislecev, ki ga sestavlja mednarodna revija HR Magazine.
In o čem bosta govorila? O avtonomnih vozilih? No. Ne. Mislim, skoraj. Govorila bosta o organizacijah brez šefov. Avtomobilih brez voznika. Pravita, da lahko organizacije preživijo brez tradicionalnih šefov. Celo veliko bolj verjetno je, da bodo uspele, zaposleni pa bodo pri svojem delu uspešni. Perry in Lisa bosta z nami delila nekatere najnovejše trende na področju manj hierarhičnih načinov dela in nas povabila, da skupaj preizkusimo decentralizirane in bolj sodelovalne načine skupnega odločanja, kar je ključno za participativne organizacije. No, da ne bomo samo mi govorili, se bom sam, vsaj za trenutek, izklopil. Lisa, Perry, please join us on stage.
Lisa, is that the first time you've ever been introduced by a bot?
Yeah, I can say it is.
I think that's probably the future in our hands right there. So it's our pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me back. And Lisa, your first time in Slovenia?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So, yeah, very excited to be here.
I think, as you can probably tell, we are going to create a conversation for you on stage here. But there is a Slovenian word that I looked up, so Google Translate, I have come up with this. So I think the emotion that we're both feeling now is preobremenjen. Overwhelmed.
Aha.
Yeah. So what we're going to talk about is, can an organization survive without bosses, right? Lisa, if you could just answer that in one word, what would it be?
Yes.
Okay, that's it. Thank you. Not really. We just want to know if the word boss is part of who you are in the workplace. Please show your hand. Are you a boss? Are you a leader or a manager or a boss? Yeah. Do people think of you as a boss? I mean, I guess that's another criteria, right? So the good news is, Lisa, I don't think we're going to make these people extinct, are we?
No, you're safe.
Okay. On your tables, you have a really nice gift from A1, one of our sponsors. Thank you, sponsors. But this is all about one of the most fascinating bossless ecosystems in the world, bees. And so I think we're going to encourage you to help us boost the bee population with planting something. I guess you could say the queen bee is the boss. And maybe there's something in that about the female leader that you might want to talk about later. Okay, can an organization survive without bosses? Let's get the clicker working. Right. So, Lisa, you want to introduce me first and I'll introduce you?
Sure.
Our story.
Yes, so you heard a little bit of an introduction to Perry and I, but Perry and I met in quite a special way, and we've been sort of partners in this journey together, really. So I think it was maybe 2013 or 14, something like that. And Perry was really one of the first people that I met in a community of people that were interested in reinventing work and making work more human and more fun and innovative. And so he was really someone that was very influential when I was starting out Reimaginaire and looking for what was my focus going to be. And Perry, you heard some of his achievements in the introduction there. He's an author, he's a speaker, and he's one of the kind of leading thought leaders, I would say, in terms of HR and the future of work. But he's also someone who likes alliteration. Yeah. And so I thought he would like this, that if I were to sum up Perry, I would say that he's someone who loves to connect people. He gets real joy out of connecting people and contributing knowledge and experience and examples and enthusiasm. And then he's also a champion of people. So he championed me and helped me get to where I am today. And he champions lots of different people. So I think he's one of the most knowledgeable and most generous people that you'll come across in this field. And I know many of you in this room know him, and I'm sure you can confirm that as well. So it's super exciting to be sharing the stage with Perry today. It's kind of a full circle thing.
Okay. I do like alliterations. I'm going to have to add another one, which is composed, because I'm now completely decomposed as a result of that. So that's very overwhelming. Thank you, Lisa. And I remember the time that I came across Lisa, and she was working as a learning designer in a company that was doing very pioneering work in digital. And I said, let's meet for lunch and let's talk about the work you do and so on. And the upshot of that was a conversation where I thought Lisa might want her company to come, for me to come work with you. I thought that might be quite nice. But actually, the total opposite happened. Lisa said, look, I'm thinking about going out. I want to get away from the machine. I want to create my own thing. And I was quite surprised by that, but equally I was quite delighted by that. And I thought, oh, I can help if I can. And so the connecting piece came from there. But what's happened with Lisa since is, I guess, a story of how people can blossom and thrive when they find their passion. So one of Competo's, I guess, key things is about finding the perfect fit and bringing passion to work. And Lisa's a human manifestation of that in a really gentle way. And so if you're into podcasts and listening to people talk about issues that are relevant in the world of work, then Lisa's podcast, Leadermorphosis, is right up there with some of the most interesting thoughts in the world. So Lisa's had the pleasure of interviewing people like Gary Hamel, a professor from London Business School, Margaret Wheatley, who's an immense thought leader and spiritualist in how work goes. So it's one to put on your playlist for sure. But the work Lisa does with Turf and with her own consultancy is all about getting under some of the issues that are plaguing the world of work from being a productive, positive, and fulfilling place for people to be. And so I can honestly say I've got no better honor than to share the stage with Lisa. She's somebody who I feel an immense kind of spiritual attachment to, but we just happen to believe in the same things. And so this whole concept of bossless organizations might sound very off the scale and dangerous to some, but I think we're in the space where we want to make it how the future of work could end up looking. So thank you, Lisa, for that great introduction. And so let's see. Thank you. Okay. So we'll start with some logos of some companies which I think you may recognize. And Lisa and I have a little bit of a mission. I don't know if anybody in the room collects like baseball cards or basketball cards or stickers. We collect logos of companies who are creating some really interesting new ways to work. Lisa, are there any of the logos there that you've got familiarity with and you've worked with you want to tell us about?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the joys of my podcast that I get to sort of lift up these examples and share, real life stories. Because as Perry said, sometimes people think, can you really work without bosses? Like, how does that actually work in practice? And so part of my mission is to share those practical stories and examples and successes and challenges. So on my podcast, I've had Nearsoft, for example, which is a company in Mexico, about 300-ish people, IT company, and they've been working without bosses for quite a long time now, yeah. And also Beetroot is a recent example I've come across, which is a company in Ukraine, also IT, founded by two Swedes, and they are a social enterprise, so they're getting people into tech. And they're growing really fast, from like 380 people today to 1,000 in the next 4 years, and they're getting lots of funding to expand. And so for them, the only way to scale at that speed in a kind of decentralized way across Ukraine is to do it as a self-managing organization. But they're very connected to their purpose and their culture, so they're growing from their culture out instead of from a sort of intellectual, structure or OD perspective. Do you want to chuck something in there?
I'm really interested in a company called DaVita. They're based in Colorado, and they make machinery that supports people with kidney problems, so dialysis machines and so on. Now, the interesting story about DaVita is they were almost bankrupt when somebody had to step into the leadership space to try and rescue the company. And as a result of that attempt, I guess you'd say, of creating some stability, Kent Thiry, who was the CEO there, said, look, I've rescued the company, but that doesn't mean to say that I should lead this company into the future unless you, the people, want me to. But equally, you can vote in somebody else. So they had a nomination process for who should step into the boss position. So I guess the interesting dynamic we have is that sometimes we talk about self-management in a way that people think nobody steps into a leadership space. But the other element to this is that people choose who they believe is the right person to lead into the future and create an environment that's much more about co-creation and collaboration. So that's an interesting story. But we've got some more. So any of those, Lisa, that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I also want to kind of build on what you were saying, that I think one of the biggest myths and misconceptions about self-managing organizations is that bossless equals leaderless. And it's very much not the case. For me, it's about making organizations leaderful and enabling everyone to step into their leadership and for natural dynamic hierarchies to emerge. And so one example that I really like is Fitzy. Fitzy is a recruitment company in Canada, and they're quite a small team, but their parent company now is also transitioning to self-management. And they have some really beautiful practices around how they give each other feedback. They've really embedded that into their culture. They also have what they call a role advice process. So anyone at any time of the year can initiate this role advice process and say, I want to change my role to maybe this, I want to shift my responsibilities. And they get advice from people in the team, and then they decide for themselves, having got that advice from people who have expertise or from people who it affects, they then decide if they take on that role or not. And they do the same thing for salaries as well. So they have totally transparent salaries, and anyone can initiate a salary advice process. And all of those processes, there's such a strong culture of trust that you would think it might be chaos or that people would ask for crazy pay rises. But it's almost always the opposite, actually, that people become much more responsible, much more having an ownership of the company. So FTSE is an example that I really like, and they have some really good leadership cultural pieces as well. So I think that's a really important aspect.
And I think the thing you're illustrating there is that leaderful example, which is where more people get the chance to step into influence and shape and change. I think there is a myth, isn't there, that people leave bad bosses. They don't leave bad companies, right? I think what we're saying is people leave bad environments, full stop. And so David Marquet, who we will look at in a second, has a great phrase. He said, the leader's role is not to fix people, but to fix the environment and enable people to step in and be more leaderful. Any others you want to talk about on that list?
Yeah, I mean, Hire is a good one because they're China. So a lot of people say, oh, well, this is all great. There's a lot of American companies and European companies, but what about beyond the West? So Hire is a company in China, I think the world's largest white goods manufacturer, 70,000 employees, and they have some 2,000 self-managed micro-enterprises. So they have these little micro-enterprises that anyone can start up. They find a customer, they have a little R&D person in their team, they develop a product, and if it pays, if there's a demand, then their little micro-enterprise thrives. And if it doesn't, then they shut it down and they start up a different one. So they have this whole ecosystem of these sort of self-managed micro-enterprises at huge scale. And they're a company that's been going since the 80s, so they've reinvented themselves significantly, like 4 or 5 times. So really visionary leader, Zhang Rumin, who's like really role modeling a different way of doing things.
And I think what I see from that is that Zhang Rumin steps into the space of helping create that ecosystem rather than directing everybody's attention and focus. So I think one of the examples that's really interesting from that is the team who were trying to build a gaming laptop. They were building such a high-powered machine. They had to get the right kind of HR to support them with developers to come and code in that way. And so internal teams within Hire had to bid for that work. So they had 3 competing HR teams bidding for the work of that gaming construct. And so the one who could demonstrate the most efficiency and the most effectiveness in recruiting in that market won that contract. So they quite literally operate as a micro system across the whole of the scheme. And then I think one of our favorites is Buurtzorg in the Netherlands. So this is a continuing story of a bossless organization where, again, the chief executive, the founder, Jos de Blok, said, we are not going to have micromanaged nurses delivering home-based healthcare. We're going to clear the pathway for you to be a nurse and not an administrator. And I think the most beautiful thing about this story is not just that nurses really love that working environment. So it's the highest ranked employer in the Netherlands year on year. I think it's the size of the corporate headquarter that supports it. For about 15,000 nurses, it's about 50 people, largely in governance and compliance and regulation. So he supported the infrastructure, but he's enabled nurses to be nurses, not administrators. And I think we see this in the healthcare systems across the world, where people are running too many tracks and they're not focused on their core competence. So their patient satisfaction is the highest in the world. And so I think if you're looking for what's the value and the product of a bossless organization, then keep talking about Buurtzorg as an example where it creates the value and it helps people become part of an ecosystem that gives them the choice of how they do their work. So these are some examples. But I guess we wanted to talk about where did this come from as a concept. So I guess we're going to take a little bit of a history look, but the military has a really interesting part to play with this. I think largely through the different tactics that need to be deployed in creating safe environments and countering things like terrorist cells. And so I mentioned David Marquet before. We saw him on stage in Miami. He's a really interesting character. And some of you may know General Stanley McChrystal from Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns for the US, who wrote a book called Team of Teams. And I don't know if you've got anything to add onto the McChrystal model of how that came through, but it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, and it's interesting because on one of the previous slides you had this ESBZ, a school, and they train all of their teachers in this team of teams philosophy as well. So it's like a decentralized model that as long as one person in a team knows one other person well and trusts that other person well in another team, then you can scale in a decentralized way in quite a sophisticated, trust-based approach.
But I think what McChrystal was doing was talking about the tactics of the US military at the time, was to roll out in tanks and armored vehicles and so on. And he realized that was not how he was fighting the insurgency. So he deconstructed the military organization and said, you need to get close to the people, you need to be small and nimble, you need to not follow orders from the center, You need to work on your own volition, really. And that was completely counter-military culture. But so successful was that in terms of deployment, that that's why the book came through in a self-management context. The Marquet story is where he took over a submarine that he wasn't expecting.
A really underperforming submarine. I think
Yeah,
the worst
in the
performing.
fleet.
Yeah.
And I think his opening sort of salvo to the team there was, you know this sub better than I do, so I need you to run this ship. But of course the Navy would say, but Captain, we follow your orders. So he had a really different way of flipping that dynamic, didn't he? I think he called it intent-based leadership.
Yes, almost like at a habit level, training people to bit by bit stop asking for permission and just start saying, I'm doing this,
Yeah.
and sort of getting him to check or confirm.
Yeah. So he still had the hierarchical kind of tick in the box for people that wanted that, but he was really turning over the ship to run by its own crew. And in fact, I think the story kind of culminates in the USS Santa Fe being the highest performer. And I love the bit where he focused on catering, where the catering team said to him, well, Captain, if other people are doing this, can we make some decisions about the food we cook on this submarine? He's like, we're in a tin can under the ocean. Of course, make it a joy-in experience. To the degree that they experimented with the food so much, all the other US submarine commanders wanted to be hosted by Marquet's chef because they had the best food. So some unexpected value and success can come when you turn off the leadership role in the traditional way and go to a bossless structure.
I also just want to add as well that one of the things I like about this case study is that when David left, the submarine continued to be high performing, so he kind of created this space for leadership that wasn't dependent on him. Sometimes we have these, visionary,
Heroes.
charismatic leaders, and then when they leave, it kind of collapses like a souffle.
Yeah.
Whereas when David left, he had created that environment, that culture, in such a powerful way that the kind of subsequent teams continue to carry it on and kind of live it.
And I love that you got a cooking metaphor in there with souffle, so thank you for that. So some of this is also backed by research. So you don't just have to listen to stories from people who've created these outrageously good exploits. So Deloitte have done a lot looking at the shape of organizations into the future for the last couple of years. And in 2017 and 2019, their research revealed something very, very interesting. That the construct of the hierarchy is not actually how people work. We think it might be. We see the flow of process and we believe that's what people follow. But actually their research said, look, committed people come together. They break out of the hierarchy. They huddle over a problem. They work together from different disciplines because they have passion, intent, and belief in each other to solve that problem. And they create a unit of people who will deliver something. Not because they've been told to do so, but because they've made the choice to do so. And I guess this supports the team of teams principle, right? And I guess you see that in some of the examples, like in Beetroot and some of the companies you've researched, that it might look like that chart, but where the work gets done is more like a collision of people who just want to come together.
Yeah, and it's a good philosophy as well to, sometimes we have teams whose purpose becomes to sustain the team instead of really meeting something that the organization needs.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's a really good indication if you have a team that kind of mobilizes, they fulfill the purpose, and then they disassemble, and that's what's needed.
Yeah. I had a client in academia in the UK, and I couldn't complete the work because I dared to tread on the territory that was their sacred committees. I questioned why committees existed. And they said, well, we've always had this committee. And I'm saying, well, what does it live for? And they couldn't really describe it. I said, well, I think you should disband it. But they loved their committee so much. They didn't love what it did. They just loved that it was there. I could see no efficiency in that at all. So I think we can see some counter examples where it is. It's about, I want to solve a problem, I'll come together, but have no worry about whether to stay together. So Deloitte have looked at that as an agility kind of competence and a successful delivery competence. So as well as doing that, we've already heard the writing on the wall about what really motivates people to succeed. And Lisa, you and I both like Dan Pink's work, right? We've seen him talk about this for a number of years. And I guess these three pillars of autonomy, mastery, and purpose are the things that we aspire to do more of when we know the kind of monetary situation and the safety we feel is there. And I don't know if you've got anything to add on this. This is now a 10-year-old piece of work.
Yeah, but I think he made it so kind of soundbitey that so many people know this now. And it was interesting, in the run-up to this event, a journalist asked me, how will the leaders of the future motivate people? And I kind of provocatively said, they won't. Because, this intrinsic motivation, it's about leadership, I think, is therefore about creating, as we said, the environment for people to be intrinsically motivated, to have that internal locus of control, instead of me as a leader being responsible for making you happy and motivated, and like that's a kind of doing something thing. So it's a different kind of paradigm.
It's a big pressure. I can remember in my early days of being a boss, that was something that really taxed me. I'm like, how do I make all these people happy? And then just the word make feels wrong now. It's like, why was I bothered about trying to make people anything other than they wanted to be and like direct their energy to where they're successful? So I think the ability to control things around you and get really good at what matters to you, connected to the higher purpose of what the company's all about, is where I think we can find some salvation even 10 years after Pink's work. And I guess the crucial thing for me is that purpose element. This is not just people saying, I would really like to waste time searching the internet to try and find stuff I don't even know is relevant to the company. This is connected exactly to why that company exists. And I see lots more narrative from companies now who are really, really maximizing the draw and the galvanizing force of their purpose. And I think in a self-managed unit, my experience, you can back this up, I'm sure, is that purpose is really critical in how you bring people together. So I don't think we'll see people sort of masquerading the purpose. It has to be a really genuine thing to bring people together. Anything else to add on that, Paul?
No, I mean, it just makes me think of charities. If you really are committed to your purpose, then if you realize your purpose, then you no longer need to be a company. So again, it's that thing of like, are you sustaining yourself or are you really trying to deliver this purpose,
So there's some interesting kind of stories and heritage around this. And one of the things I've been looking at for a long time now is digital social technologies. I mean, they've been around now for a long time, like 15 plus years and counting, to the point that, social technology is like so ubiquitous. It's a utility like light and electricity. And I think younger people, and me included, have an anxiety when there's no Wi-Fi and the battery's running low, right? Because this disconnect thing is not where we want to be. And so Andrew McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson, who are two MIT professors, have looked at this whole dynamic, and they've written a book and coined a phrase about the machine that supports that whole thing, so our connected infrastructure, the platforms that we find our applications on, and the crowd that convene on that. And my experience of what the reaction is to their work is like, wow, this is almost like a philosophical revelation for what social technology is. But if you played with TikTok, I don't think there's much philosophy going on there. But anyway, connecting people on a platform with machinery is what I guess they're talking about. But this is nothing new. And so we have seen this kind of technology before. And so the technology clicker does not want to play with me now. There we go. We've had this analog version of that forever, really. We have had machinery. We just call it different things, right? So our customs, our protocols, and our purpose is our machinery that holds us together, right? It's the kind of mechanics of being. And the platforms with which that's manifested on are not Facebook, but they are companies and cooperatives and communities that we belong to. And the crowd that we happen to find there happen to be also our colleagues, collaborators, and this thing called conveners, people who bring people together. And what's really interesting about some of this is I think this is backed up by a lot of psychological research anyway. And so Lisa and I are both kind of interested in a concept around this that we call spiral dynamics, which is part of natural adaptive systems, which connects back to my story of the bees. There's nothing more mesmerizing than watching a murmuration of starlings move across the sky. There is no boss starling. There is no strategy for the starlings. They don't have a business plan. They are looking out for each other in a movement and a symphony, I guess you'd say, of connectivity to look out for each other. And that's where I think biomimicry is a fascinating aspect to self-management. But I talked about spiral dynamics, Lisa, and I know you and I are both kind of inspired by what this looks like. So when the clicker gets to play, then we'll look at that. I think we must be on a... There we go. So this is a little bit of history and philosophy and anthropology thrown into one, and we're fascinated by this. So I'm happy to kind of bounce around with you on this kind of stuff.
I guess like one starting point is that I think Perry and I both came to this kind of world of spiral dynamics through a book that really inspired us and galvanized our communities. And perhaps some of you have read it. It's called Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. Can I see if anyone's read that book? Yeah, a few of you. Yeah, I think it's really kind of started a movement around the world that's growing in momentum, where people are sort of seeking another way of doing things. So, and at the core of it is this spiral dynamics.
Exactly. And it looks at human collective endeavor and society and culture and so on. And so if we go back to a kind of prehistory thing where we were small bands of family foragers moving around actually where food was and shelter was, the interesting thing about how we've developed socially and so on is largely built around things like communication, because we formed into tribal structures when we managed to master the art of language. And so we had people who could not necessarily be a boss, but just a great storyteller, who would actually bring the history of the tribe to part of an identity. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't all just sitting around a fire telling stories. There was some pretty bloodthirsty stuff going on there. There was some power dynamics of the nature that we perhaps see in some toxic companies. But we genuinely started to come together built around stories, and the heritage started to build us into a more intellectually connected force, which then led us into the printed word. And so the printing press and the proliferation of things like literature created institutions. And so we see monarchies and governments and military and education coming through that medium. So it was almost like if we could master the spoken word and then the written word, that's where the boss power terminology came through. And of course, that then moved us into industrial, which is kind of where we still are, where economics and mercantilism and commerce became the nature of how you become powerful. So you went from, I guess, distilling down the written word to creating an infrastructure and machinery to build things and the society we have now. But I guess the hope, and perhaps this is where Lisa can illuminate in, is that that's not where we stop. We have not hit peak humanity with industrialization. There is more to come. And that's where purpose-led and wholeness comes in. And I think this is where we're most enamored by this space.
Yeah, so I think in the last decade or so, maybe, in particular, these kind of purpose-led organizations have emerged more. Organizations that are, nowadays thinking about, that triple bottom line. What impact are we having on the environment? Becoming a B Corp, perhaps. Thinking about the people in our organization, about our communities. What are we really serving in terms of, bigger than just us as a company making money? And then leading into this very emergent kind of paradigm, you could say, where people are now looking for something more than that, to bring their whole self to work, to be much more self-managed in terms of autonomy, and to have a sense of purpose that's much more evolutionary instead of one person kind of setting the course in a kind of rigid way. It's much more like sensing and responding, which is a totally different kind of paradigm to some of these previous versions of organizations and communities that we've seen.
And I guess whether we agree with the tactics or not, if I were to say to you who leads the Extinction Rebellion, you could not point to one person. So that's a lot of people stepping into a wholeness kind of space, saying, I'm more bothered about the planetary destruction than many, and so we're going to come together with that kind of sense of what we want to achieve in the world. I think the other interesting aspect of this is how we have been in the boss kind of role, right? So we were reacting as a boss in the foraging community because we had to be. We were kind of aggressor, and some of that may have been through gentler forms of storytelling, but we were trying to hold some power. And then with institutions, that's where we really developed the politica, somebody who could work with that kind of agenda-based approach. And the strategizer was the king/queen in the industrial era because we had to build the strategies to deliver what we've got. But where we talk about inspiring and then we talk about enlightening, which is the next stage, you can see the difference in what we expect and see in leading and managing roles. So I think the inspire and the enlightener talks a little bit more to what we have known as the power game, holding desperately onto control by force or by manipulation or by some form of strategy, to then going into a space of influence. So I wonder if we're now starting to see a shift from holding power to generating influence. And that's the way we galvanize human spirit. That's the way we lead to a dictionary definition of self-management, which isn't chaos, it isn't anything negative. It's about people being themselves in the most productive way possible. Now, if you were to ask all of the boards in all of the companies across the world, do you want your people to be more productive? I think the answer would be a big fat yes, don't you? I can't see many people saying, no, let's not bother with productivity. It kind of goes against everything. But I think the way to that now is not to force and conscript, but to influence people. So I think we've seen the role of manager become the role of coach. So all of you put your hand up and said, yeah, I think I'm a boss. The future, I think, for you is to think about influence and be that coach. And I would suggest that's a much nicer way to be a boss anyway.
Yeah, and again, to this question of like, is AI going to replace us all, and are managers going to become extinct? I think the answer is no, but I think that the more human things, this coaching thing, to be someone that really supports people and helps them draw on their own potential in a way that's much more about choice than coercion. Coercion was the power game.
Yeah.
Influence game is about choice and empowering people to make choices, and that's a very different thing.
I think there's lots of psychology that talks about the power of choice. And so some of the theory of both psychology and sociology that sits behind this, sociocracy has been around with us for a long time. So Auguste Comte, I think, coined the phrase in the mid-1800s, at the height of the industrial era, when he studied teams who were given instructions about how to work, but he watched the dynamic within the team about how they did that work. And they formed into a little mini governance structure. They formed into feedback loops for each other to know that they were doing the right thing. And they created consent-based decision-making in their own microcosm environment. So maybe the bosses in the industrial factory would have thought they're following our every whim, but what they were doing is creating their own social structure within that because they had to. And I don't know if you've got anything else to add on sociocracy?
Yeah, for me, the kind of the interesting thing is that self-management is nothing new.
Yeah.
This is like the 18th century.
Yeah.
And so it isn't something revolutionary, but it's interesting because it seems like there is an appetite now. There's something in the air where there's much more in the mainstream a sense that, that kind of industrial paradigm is working less well. So what else is there? And so it's really interesting to see these organizations like in the healthcare industry where cost cutting and austerity and stuff is really hurting them, that there's now this other way of working, this alternative that's much more human, and it's also better in terms of performance. So it's this kind of win-win.
And Kees Burker and Gerard Endenberg in the Netherlands in the 1970s looked intensely at this through things like Peace Corps. And I've heard stories about people who work for Médecins Sans Frontières who literally operate on a sociocratic structure because they have to. They're dealing with humanitarian aid. They can't have a board meeting in the middle of an Ebola crisis. They have to mobilize sensibly with each other. And then there's one you may have heard of, holacracy. And Lisa, I know you've spoken to Brian Robertson on your podcast, who kind of created this system. And so you're quite familiar with this, aren't you?
Yeah, and Brian Robertson, he came from the tech world, so he's very much designed an operating system for organizations. So I think it's where people are finding this useful is that if you're a sort of hierarchical, traditionally structured organization and you want to explore something else, but it feels very scary to sort of step into nothing, then holacracy gives you a framework, quite a detailed, thorough framework for you to step into that helps you with structure and really clear granular roles and governance, meeting formats and decision-making processes. So they have this kind of constitution that sort of devolves authority from the CEO into this structure. So it's an interesting idea, and Brian and I had a really good conversation. But I know that Perry and I, we're sort of, we have our sort of skeptical thoughts about it. We really, I think, appreciate elements of it. But for me, at least, there are aspects of it that feel a little bit imposing, once you implement holacracy, you can't then kind of riff on the structure, But some people are taking elements of holacracy, and Brian said that whilst he doesn't, wholeheartedly recommend that, if you want the full benefits, he says to take the whole structure. But I know a lot of organizations that are just taking the roles process or the integrative decision making or the governance meetings. So I think you can use it as a way to, as a starting point, and then build your own system.
I guess like a mixing desk for our sound engineers in the room. And so I've worked with a client who had a part of the holacratic system that they created nested circles of people very focused on products and research and servicing. And then they created a fairly traditional hierarchy along the side of it for outward-facing client work and new market opportunities. So actually, don't believe the myth that people say it's either self-management or traditional, because it's not. It can work in a very fluid exchange, and I think it's all about the most relevant for the nature of the work that's being done. And I think that's why we would probably take aspects of holacracy.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that as well that I met someone this morning who's from Danfoss, and I spoke to one of your colleagues in the Danish office, who was talking about ambidextrous organizations. So we're not saying that self-management is going to be the one model to rule them all, But I think it's much more about this, both and thing where we can coexist, and it's all about what is your purpose and what model is going to best help you serve that purpose. And so you can have self-managing teams within a kind of hierarchical structure, and that can work really well if you have that kind of dialogue and reciprocal communication.
And building on that is a concept called Liquido, and now it goes too far, from a really clever Italian guy I know called Stelio Vezzara. And so his company has created an operating system of its own. So he works with some huge companies at scale. And what he's trying to create is this more fluid organization. So it has structure, it has construct, but it isn't fixed and bolted. It moves. So it's a little bit like natural systems that don't get broken in gale force winds, but they bend with the energy of the wind, so they don't get disrupted. And so you may have heard this called the anti-fragile organization, where there is much more about responsiveness and movement. And so that talks about collaborative boards and contribution accounting, very open dialogue. Reputation tracking and collaborative decision-making form this interwoven aspect, where again, people step into a leading role, not just holding management positions. So there are lots of theories out there with which this can be backed up. But how does it work in practice, I guess, is the question. You're probably thinking there saying, yeah, there's some of this I really like, I'd like to experiment, but how? So hopefully we're going to try and decode some of that for you. So this talks to a psychological model that I think we probably have operating in all of our organizations at the moment. And some of this will be about episodes. So when things are really challenging, and so Lisa talked about austerity and financial cuts in healthcare, the temptation is to go very low on autonomy and very low on alignment and just say to people, just get on with it. We haven't got time to spend on those fluffy things. So we get into this really scrutinized enforcing role. Now that might be okay to manage an emergency, but we're probably not in an emergency state for 18 months. That would be some kind of emergency. So we genuinely tend to see people move a little bit up the scale so the alignment is a bit more directed. And so we see people in a managed space. And then we go from the emergency into stabilized operating systems. But people are still quite low on autonomy because they're managed. And then I think your experience is probably where you've seen companies go on this right-hand side and almost react to the management and go, no, we don't want to be like that now, and go into that bottom corner. Have you seen that happen?
Yeah, I call it like the pendulum swing sometimes, where a lot of organizations swing too far in the opposite direction, or there's a misunderstanding that self-management means everyone does whatever they want.
Yeah.
And it's very much not that. That will result in chaos and resentment, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's definitely a trap.
Yeah.
That especially kind of trendy organizations, when they want to reject the traditional, can fall into that pitfall.
Yeah. And I've seen companies who've developed even a thirst for agile, who think agile is in that space. And then they turn around and say, agile didn't work in our organization. Well, it's because they just had no alignment to what it was there to do. It was almost like autonomy on speed. It was crazy. But the top is the sweet spot, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So there's alignment and there's autonomy. So it's not, I also think there's a good quote about that self-management also doesn't mean that everyone is equal. That it's much more about having a sense of, what are we trying to achieve and who is best to do that, and how can we agree that and talk about that in a much clearer way and be clearer about decision making, which we're going to talk about in a moment as well.
Exactly. And then you've particularly favoured this kind of model during your work with tough leadership.
Yeah, exactly. So this is my colleague Carl Eric. He came up with this model that I think is really interesting for observing that there are kind of two main trends out there, for organizations in the world who are saying, we want to do something differently. We want to be more innovative, agile, responsive. Some organizations look at structures and processes. Let's become more agile, or let's adopt lean, or results-only work environment, or holacracy. And it tends to be, but it's not always, startups or smaller organizations or IT or tech. And as I said, they can sometimes end up in that trap where there's a bit of a leadership vacuum. Yeah. And you end up with often like a buddy culture where, we all respect each other and care about each other a lot, but we're a bit scared to give each other feedback or hold each other accountable. So that's sometimes the kind of trap of that. And then other organizations are looking in another dimension, which is more the kind of human part, if you like. I'm not going to use the word soft because I don't like that word. But it's about mindset and leadership and culture. So I think that if you as an organization want to become an agile organization, and I'm sure many of you are discovering this as well, that it's more than just the structures and processes. Yeah. There's some unlearning that we have to do in terms of our habits, in terms of how we relate to each other, in terms of the culture that we create, and creating, as I said, leaderful organizations. So some organizations may be kind of orthodox in their structure, but they're investing in this kind of mindset, leadership, culture piece. And then, of course, some organizations are doing both, like, Buurtzorg, the example that Perry gave. So I think it's, you might be thinking for yourselves as you're sitting there, where would I place my organization? Like, where might we be in our journey currently? And where could we perhaps put some more focus or explore a little bit more?
And again, thinking about organizations as a whole system, they're made up of lots of interconnected microsystems, so you can experiment with both a different leadership culture and structure in a microcosm within your organization. So a lot of people are saying, I'm a huge organization, this is convulsive and threatening. And it's like, well, it is if you're trying to do the whole thing at the same time. But if you could find the places where the experiments would reveal the benefits and the value that it would create, then you can think about replication after that. So we do not have to have convulsive shifts across this. We can build this quite gently. And I think that's how the leadership and the culture plays quite nicely into that. And then you've got this lovely sort of piece from Mickey.
Yeah, so I interviewed Mickey for the podcast a few months ago, and she blew my mind. She's an amazing woman. She's a trainer in something called nonviolent communication, which is perhaps some of you are familiar with it. It's a totally different way of communicating that's based on needs and taking responsibility for my emotions and how I react to things. And she said that, in order for self-managing organizations, or in general, I think, in order for organizations to really shift towards, the direction that I think we all in this room want to go to, then 3 shifts need to take place. So the first is that the people who hold structural power, i.e. the managers or, the people who have authority, that there's a kind of inner process, an inner work that needs to be done, which is about unlearning my habits of kind of top-down behaviors, perhaps. It's about learning how to listen to other perspectives, to sort of step back, if I summarize it. So that, that is scary. And for many of us who are managers and perhaps have built our whole career on that identity, it's no small thing to sort of let go of that and to develop something that we haven't learned from school or workplaces, so it is really painful in some ways. It's kind of like a growth pain to explore what is leadership when I'm not that. And then the second shift is in the people who don't hold structural power. So those people who aren't managers or who are perhaps from sort of oppressed groups, so they historically haven't really had a voice. Those people also need to undergo a shift, which is about overcoming fear and overcoming deference, waiting for someone else to solve something. So instead, it's about learning how to make proposals, to see a challenge or an opportunity and say, hey, I've noticed this thing, what can we do about that? And that is also really scary. So, these are really big human shifts that need to happen. Again, it's that kind of like mindset, leadership, culture piece. And then the final shift, just noticed all the numbers say 1. The third shift is redesigning the 5 core systems that make up our organizations. So this I found really useful because, again, when people say, I'm interested in this, but where do I start? So I think these 5 core systems are a good starting point. If you take, 1 or 2 of those that you feel most energized by and you think, well, maybe we could explore something in that area, then I think you're well on your way to shifting something. So on the next slide is those 5 systems.
And just to add to that, most of the work I've been doing with clients lately has been commissioned by somebody who's in the leading position who wants to let go of some of that structural power. Now that makes it a lot easier for me because I'm not butting up against somebody's lack of will to let go. So actually that enabling infrastructure of somebody who says, I'm the leader, but I don't want to hold control of everything. And so I'm talking about people in local authority, in healthcare, and in huge organizations who just realize the scale of it is ridiculous, and they want to get more people to step into that role of accepting responsibility. And interestingly, the reaction on the second point is I then find some people who are very comfortable pushing things up to somebody else, going, do you know what? I don't want to do that decision. I'll rely on the person who gets paid more than me to do it. And so that, you might think people love a sense of liberation. Not necessarily. So I don't even think that's a kind of Stockholm syndrome factor.
I have a lot of organizations I speak to who say, hey, Lisa, we declared self-management. Why aren't people stepping in? I don't get it. We gave them permission.
Yeah.
And I say it's because of this second shift. And
Yeah.
it's like creating that environment and
Yeah.
supporting people and challenging them
Yeah.
in a loving way. What is it? What's in the way for you to really step in?
Yeah.
What do you need?
Yeah. So here's those 5 core systems.
Yeah, so the 5 core systems are decision-making. So self-managing organizations, contrary to, I think, what many people think, are very clear and thorough on how decisions are made. So who makes which decisions, with what process, who is informed about that decision, who is involved in that decision. So most of these organizations have very detailed, shared understanding of that. And the second one is resource distribution. So resources meaning people in their different roles, and also money and energy. How do we distribute those resources, and is it aligned with our purpose and our values as an organization? And then the third one is information flow. So again, you can kind of use these as like a diagnosis sometimes. So I speak to some organizations who are saying, we've become self-managing, but people still aren't taking responsibility. And usually I discover that somewhere in the information flow, there's like a kind of hoarding of knowledge or data or information. And people, if people aren't connected to the impact of the work that I do, if I don't actually feel the pain or the joy of the work that I do because I'm not directly in communication, in contact with that result or that information, then why would I take responsibility for it? So it's making sure that information flow is really going to all the places in the organization so that people can make the decisions because they have the information to make them. And actually, your colleague Matteo from Danfoss, he had a great thing about decision making, that when people come to him and say, I think we're self-managed and I'm a pretty empowering leader, he asks them, okay, so tell me the last 5 decisions that you disagreed with as a manager that still went ahead. So I thought that was quite a good indication, that's like a really good test, if me as a leader, if I'm really able to step back. It doesn't mean I abdicate. So it's not the same as abdication, but it's like much more, if my team has good reasons for something and I disagree, can I really live with that decision? And how much is the team going to learn from that decision, whether it succeeds or not, right? And then the final 2 core systems are feedback loops. So we saw that on the slide about sociocracy as well. So we learn through knowing our impact on others. So we need to create feedback loops, data about, what am I doing? What impact is it having? What can I improve? So creating those structures is really important. And then conflict engagement. So often, again, I speak to organizations that say, yes, that one we haven't quite worked out yet. I mean, we had some policies, but nobody really knows what they are. And so this is really key. And again, it's not a kind of top-down conflict engagement approach, but it's really kind of listening to each other as human beings and saying, what would be a good way of engaging with conflict, not avoiding it, but really acknowledging that conflict is going to happen because we're human beings, we're all different. So if we can learn to embrace conflict and transform it, on the other side of conflict is so much potential in terms of understanding each other better, learning. So sort of embracing that and getting really clear on what do we do when someone's in conflict? How do we support people through that? So these 5 core systems, if you can start to sort of, go on your mixing desk again and kind of tweaking these things, then you're well on your way to having a much more self-managed system, or a system that you want. And if you don't, then Mickey says the danger is that we just inherit the old systems. So if we don't consciously redesign them or sort of check, are these really in line with our purpose and values, then we're just going to inherit the old ones. So it's about being much more conscious, I think, and healthy.
And I think if we look ahead to an AI-enabled organization, I would suggest that those top 3 are going to be hugely impacted by AI. We are going to see decision-making done by algorithm. We are going to see we're seeing resource distribution happen by algorithm. The Uber driver does not have a boss. The algorithm tells him where his next work is. And we're also going to see information flow exploded by AI. So we are going to have access to, at the second we want it, information to inform a decision. And we're going to turn that to the machines. So I guess the human systems around that need to adopt an understanding of what that means. But do you know what? The 2 toughest parts of self-management are the bottom 2, feedback loops and conflict engagement. because we kind of go, oof, that's the really tough stuff. I'll do some resource planning instead, right? We just make that choice. We won't have that choice as much in the future. We will have to get better at learning through feedback loops, and we'll have to get better at creative tension. And as you say, there's some super learning on the other side of that. So that's why I think some people say sometimes, actually self-management is harder than an autocratic system. It's like, well, of course it is. But the output, the longevity, the commitment, and all those factors are being lost. So I think there's something really powerful about the future. But I think it's time for people to work, don't you?
Yes. So this is the interactive part of our session. So we're going to focus on that top left-hand one, decision making, because I think this is, we aren't going to have time to sort of really delve into how can you guys, start some self-management experiments on a grand scale. But maybe if we drill down to decision making, we can just get some little insights. So I'd like you to each write down on your notepads or on a piece of paper, on your phone, whatever your preference, just write down 2 to 3 decisions that you've made in your work in the last 2 to 6 months. So it might be, made a decision about hiring this person or approving this project or, whatever it is. So see if you can come up with a couple of different decisions. So you have a little bit of variety to play with. Okay, so you can continue to write them down, but as you're doing that, so one of the first, I think, steps in transitioning or transforming something is awareness. So it helps to be aware that there are different types of decision making. And some of these might be obvious and some of these might not be so obvious. But it's interesting that I think most of us human beings in our workplaces, in our teams, in our lives, we make decisions in a really sort of unconscious, out of habit way. And we're often not consciously choosing, how am I making this decision? Is this the right decision or the most effective decision-making method for this decision? So we make thousands of decisions every day as human beings, and we think about them very, very rarely. So the different types of decisions are autocratic, of course. So if I, as a manager, decide, I'm going to decide this, I'm not going to involve anyone else, it's my call. So I'm the decision maker, there's no participation, but the advantage is it's fast, right? It's just one person deciding, I can do it really quickly. Majority vote, the collective is involved then, and the collective is also accountable in terms of the decision. And there is some involvement, but it might be superficial, because if I say, let's put a vote for this thing, then your only participation is sort of this or this. So it's a bit limited. You're not really sort of offering feedback, perhaps. So there is some participation, but it's superficial. But it's pretty fast, so that's beneficial sometimes. And then we have the advice process. So if you click forward to the next slide, this is, for those of you who aren't familiar with the advice process, the idea is that if I, as an individual contributor, if I want to move something forward, then I decide I'm going to initiate the advice process. And if everyone agrees that, yes, I can make that decision, that makes sense, then I go forward and I consult people who are experts and I consult people who are affected by the decision. And maybe the extent to which a lot of people are going to be affected, then I might ask for advice from more people. And then I consider their advice, and I might go through the loop several times. If I have a proposal and a few people say, oh, I don't know, Lisa, that sounds a bit risky. Have you thought about this? Da da da. Oh yeah, that's a good point. I might revise my proposal and then get some more advice. And then ultimately, when I feel ready, I make the decision. So if you go back to the previous slide. So in the advice process, it's me that initiates it. I'm the decision maker, but I do get participation from other people, which kind of builds in a bit of a common sense thing, where I'm not going to make a stupid decision, or I'm much less likely to make one because I've had advice from my colleagues and I've kind of asked people who have expertise and experience. So it's, unless I'm a kind of not nice person, I'm probably going to take that into account. Or if I make a stupid decision, that's going to affect my reputation and my social capital and whether people trust me or not. So I might learn, okay, next time maybe I will actually take on board their advice. And then consent, as we talked about in the sociocracy slide, this is a different kind of decision-making where it's not the usual thing where we say, so everyone agree with this decision? Great, okay, let's go ahead. It's a bit more nuanced than that, where I say, here is the proposal. Does anyone object? And an objection means, is this going to harm us as an organization or move us backwards? And that's a different kind of question. Because before I might say something, well, I don't know, da, da, da. But if it's phrased like that, then it's only if I feel really strongly that it's going to harm us or move us backwards that I'll say I object. So otherwise, it's kind of built for learning and advancing and taking action. So consent-based decision-making is a really effective method in self-managing organizations. And it's pretty fast. Once you get good at it, you can do it quickly. And then finally, you have consensus or unanimity, which I always struggle to say. And again, everyone is involved in this, everyone participates, but it can be very slow. So I think a lot of people when they hear self-managing organizations, they assume that all decisions are made this way, that everyone must decide everything. And that's not the case. You have these different decision-making methods, and it's much more about deciding together which makes sense for which kind of decision, and what's the impact of that going to be? What are the kind of pros and cons? So consensus sometimes is a good decision-making method to use if you want to get everyone's buy-in, and it's a decision that affects everyone, and it's important that people really support it. But you probably wouldn't want to use it all the time because it would be slow. So you have these decision-making methods on your table as well. You have a handout with them, with icons that Perry provided. So just turn to the person next to you on your table, and looking at those 2 or 3 decisions you wrote down, which method did you use for each of them? So was it autocratic? Was it consensus? Was it advice process? Was it majority? So just talk to each other. What methods did you use? So can you put your hand up if one or more of those decisions that you made in the last 2 to 6 months was an autocratic decision? So show of hands for autocratic. Okay, quite a few. Put your hand up if one or more of the decisions that you made was a majority vote, where you had people vote yes or no. Yeah, a couple of those. Okay. Did anyone have one of those decisions was an advice process decision?
Oh.
Oh, wow. I'm impressed. That's really good. Did anyone have a consent-based decision of their decisions? Yeah. Hey, you guys are a pretty progressive audience.
Yeah.
And who had any consensus decisions?
Just a few.
A couple?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Interesting. So it's useful to sort of notice, what kind of decisions are we making about decisions?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think we're probably pleasantly surprised about the advice process being part of it. But I guess what we have to take into account, I think, with self-management is sometimes cultural sensitivity, right? So if we were in, I don't know, some high-tech environment in Silicon Valley, we might have lots of consent and advice. But if we were in the banking industry in Wall Street, we might have a lot of autocratic decisions. So even within countries, different sectors and industries might have a different decision-making culture. So cool. So I think what we've got now is a chance to have a little look at some of the sort of summaries, really, I guess, to sort of take away. So we had another exercise there, but we're gonna give you a little bit of time for questions, and then, of course, in the break, we are going to be around to answer questions. And then this thing, again, is playing up. I don't know what's going on with clickers today. Come on, clicker, do your thing. Can we just go back one slide, Mihai, please? Okay, cool. So this is our summary, really. So we'll kind of take these points and sort of read them out a little bit. But I think what we hope you have found is that self-management is not some unnatural state. This is not something we are saying to people, oh, we're going to be a bit crazy and go self-management. And people go, well, that's not normal. Well, of course it is. But in the modern world of work, it might feel very, very contrasting to the systems that people are used to. Because we've created and engineered a whole different dynamic that we've suddenly become very conditioned and used to. And we know of some schools which are incredibly social in the way they learn. So Lisa and I were talking this morning. I know a school in the Netherlands where the 8-year-old pupil, their parent and their teacher every quarter create their curriculum for the following quarter. An 8-year-old pupil creates its own curriculum. But the maturity level of student participation there is through the roof. So this second one, Lisa, I think there's something you're really seeing a lot about process management.
Yeah, so I think this makes me think of something that Gary Hamel said as well, that it used to be enough that if you had people's loyalty and diligence and obedience, that you were kind of set as an organization. But if we want people to have these skills in terms of courage and creativity and bringing these, he calls them like gifts, magic powers. If we really want people to bring those, then it's a totally different kind of leadership. And I think self-management is one of the ways that we can help create those conditions to really draw out the most of people, to allow people to be the most of themselves.
And I think going back to AI, if we use machine learning to understand our, efficiency levels, these things like intention, trust, belief, creativity, these are the things the machines will struggle to manage, but we will need to work with them as human dynamics. And then, as Lisa said earlier on, it appears harder to do because we have to unlearn several decades of conditioned management, autocratic, cascade, hierarchical methods. And so I think that's why the final couple of points are really strong for us as well. It's seen as a niche, but I think we would say that's not the case.
Yeah, and I think, again, someone asked me, like, do you think self-management is a trend? Do you think it's a fad? And I really believe that it isn't. Because, looking at these healthcare organizations, for example, they are making huge steps in terms of results, in terms of patient satisfaction, employee satisfaction, and I cannot see them going back. So it's not that self-management is a cure-all. It's not, this kind of shiny holy grail for all organizations. But in some situations, in some circumstances, it really is magic. It can really unlock something. And I think whether we, in this room, whether we decide that we're going to be a self-managing organization or not, it's not about, good or bad or right or wrong. But I think there is something that we can all learn from these examples of organizations in terms of how they're thinking about collaboration and leadership. And clarity in terms of, that autonomy, mastery, purpose thing.
And my team and I are just about to work with a very large telecoms company in the UK who have had a self-management experiment with their engineers. And they know it's successful, but they can't point to where because they're too close to it. They don't understand the value that it's created. So we're coming in independently to give it a scorecard and some mechanisms and some value impacts. But they know it works, so they want to replicate it. But other people will say, show me the evidence, show me the data, before they'll be convinced. So I think that's where we wanted to leave it with you. I'm not sure how long we've got for questions or whether we can just take them over coffee. What do you reckon?
We have time for questions.
Couple of questions? Yes. Okay, great. Okay. So has anybody got a burning question out there? And then, like I say, we can take some in the break. And believe me, we're still the warm-up act for Alexander Zardel, so you've got the best to come. But any questions from the audience before we break for coffee? Yeah, we have one down here. Okay. Do you want to? Oh, we have a roving microphone. Thank you. Self-managed there.
Hi. First, you hear me, yeah. Really great presentation, really great speech. My name is Leon. I come from Elan. Maybe you know us for skis.
Yeah.
Now, it's not so much a question, it's more a thought and maybe a direction how you guys think what you showed here could be more applicable to, let's say, the region and the space we live in, so basically to Slovenia.
Yeah.
And, in a way I cannot avoid the thing of, in a way, ideology, because also if you look at Zizek, who is a very profound philosopher, meanwhile, he plays a lot with ideology, even to a funny thing like the toilets and so on. Maybe you read that. And I think it didn't struck us as much, at least this didn't struck me as much as it might struck some audience from more Anglo-Saxonic world, where, sorry to use the word, colonial ideology is more profound than here, because in the ideology we lived maybe, 20, 30 years ago, had some roots of self-management. Well, there were, of course, things that were wrong, and the accountability was missing, the responsibility was missing. But I think the companies in this area have certain roots of self-management, at least the ones that are here for 30 or 40 years. And as a leaders, if we detect that and add the ingredient of purpose, which also the brands have, and add the accountability and responsibility, we might go in the right direction. And I think the audience was not so surprised by what you were saying here, and you detected that by also the hands on the advice. So that's my just thought, how to apply this in this actual space and country we live in.
Yeah, I mean, you can, in a moment, you can say something more to the Slovenia piece, because I know that you've been working here for the last few years. But generally, I want to say that it's super interesting. I'm leading courses and speaking at events like this all around the world, in India, in Nepal, in all kinds of places. And I think all different cultures have different ideologies, different kind of dominant cultures. Some are more hierarchical than others, for example. So I think everyone is starting from a different place.
Yep.
And we'll all see different things, listen from different ears, I guess. And so for me, it's like being much more conscious and aware and seeing, where are the areas where we could really challenge ourselves or where we really want to inspire ourselves to do something differently or, so that's something that I would comment.
So I think there's probably a reason I keep coming back here, is because I believe in this stuff so much. It fits the cultural identity that you already have here in Slovenia. So what I'd say is, I think what we're trying to say is, there is something about this that is just about tuning and nuancing and taking to another level of understanding. And I think we would all say, do not make the same mistakes as the Western world and the Anglo-Saxon world. Do not go there, because we're trying to fight against that. We're trying to pull away from machinery into a much more egalitarian and inclusive and dynamic approach, which if you already have built in, then don't let that upgrade be the wrong upgrade to your operating system. Build on the identity and the credentials and the belief systems you have, and I think take these approaches to become identifiable symbols of that shift that you're making. So I'd say that too. So that's probably why I do like to come back. Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
I'm drawn to rebellious.
Yeah, we feel very at home. Very at home. Yeah, cool. Mancha?
We also had. Okay. So we also had a question on Slido, which was most liked by you. And it was, what should a leader do when people are slacking or don't take up responsibility and some other employees are working much more than them?
Okay, that's a good question. You want to start on that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I spend a lot of time doing is leading trainings for leaders to develop the kind of mindset and skills needed to have more like adult-to-adult dynamics with their employees and colleagues. And so I get asked a flavor of this question a lot, so you're talking about adult-to-adult as opposed to parent-child, but what if your employees insist on being children? Yeah. Then what do you do? And there's no magic pill, unfortunately, but I think that it is a lot about, if I be a bit difficult and challenging, then I would say, leadership, one definition of leadership is seeing yourself as the source of things around you. So if people are sort of slacking or if something's going on there, being really curious about, what's that about and what's needed, what's missing, and sort of listening for that, tuning into that, because perhaps there's something coming from you in terms of contributing to that dynamic. It's not about, blame, but it's about, both. It takes two to tango, right? There's some kind of acknowledgement of what's the contribution and creating together that relationship, saying, hey, this is the purpose, this is the alignment. I want us to work in a way where you're taking much more responsibility and ownership for your work, and I as a manager want to support you in that, and I'm just curious to hear from you, what do you need in order to do that? What's in the way for you? How can we create a good dynamic together?
Just to build on that, I think self-management has a lovely way of having no place to hide if you're a slacker, right? So I think the concept of working out loud and of sharing your work and status of how far you are towards your milestones in a very public sense creates peer accountability. I've seen people be much more responsive to letting their peers down, but they are quite happy to let their manager down every day or every week or hide that fact. So I think actually socializing this creates a more collegiate dynamic, which I see as being a successful way of avoiding slacking. Then I think when it does start to fail, then I think the team has a responsibility to say, we are not going to come down on you and punish you. We just want to know why we couldn't spot it and help you. And offer that kind of non-violent solution communication. That works wonders. I've seen that literally invent the way teams feedback.
Yeah, and I think about, we had one logo on the slide before, Morningstar, which is a tomato processing company. So not a particularly sort of sexy company, but they've been self-managing for a long time, and they have these colleague letter of understanding. So each person in the company, a lot of them are seasonal workers, but they write a letter to each other saying, hey, Perry, I'm accountable to you for this, and you're accountable to me for this, and it just sort of makes that contract a bit more explicit, so that, if you don't do that, then I can have a conversation with you about it, because we were clear, and I can sort of, hold you to your integrity, like, hey, that didn't happen, what's going on?
Yeah. And I can't wait until we make a contract with our bots.
Thank you.
Okay, cool.
Okay, and another question that we really liked from Slido was also, which goes a little bit with what you were saying in the end, new workforces come from traditional educational systems,
Yeah.
which does not support and show how to work in such ways. Any tips on how to address that?
Wow. Okay, so I'll start on that one. So I think we have to catch people early. So I'd say if you've got an HR responsibility, part of your onboarding is to not just say, here's your desk, here's a few corporate headlines, get on with your work. It is to immerse people in understanding this is what it feels like to be here. And to experience it on a much, much more sort of deeper psychological level than just functional level. People like to know they can fit in, and I think you help them fit in there. So I think if we catch them really early, so if our graduate schemes are geared towards almost like a little experience before we unleash them on the work about how we work, then I think what we do becomes a lot easier. So I do that. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, two things that I want to say. One is that, I mean, generally, and you and I are super passionate about this, we need to reinvent education as much as we need to reinvent organizations. So one of my side passions is traveling the world and visiting alternative schools like ESBZ in Berlin, Green School in Bali, and all these different schools that are doing this self-management thing in education. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
And the other thing I want to say is, that second shift that I had on the screen before, that there needs to be a shift in those who don't have structural power, to be sort of compassionate and empathetic towards these young people. I hear a lot of people complaining about millennials and these entitled millennials that... and it's sort of like, being compassionate, that is how they've been wired through the system. And so if we can be curious, if we can really listen to people, and also like that accountability thing, if we can place responsibility with them as well. So it's not about being nice and fluffy, but it's about, tough and empathetic. It's like this psychological safety and accountability. And we can help retrain them. They do this in the Marines. They help train people from external locus of control, like, oh, I'm a victim of my circumstances, to training them to use and develop their internal locus of control. How can I be responsible for my destiny in my life? So I think it's also about different kinds of dialogues.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can really relate to the last sentence. So I have a feeling we don't have to worry about our future. Yeah.
I think it's self-managed. There we go.
And that we're nothing to be afraid of. So
No. Okay. Cool.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks a lot.